Welcome everyone to our follow-up webinar as the continuation of the employment law seminar for Fredrikson and Byron continues. This session addresses remote workers, here to stay, question mark. We'll discuss a variety of topics today. I want to take care of a couple of introductions and set the scene for what we are going to experience today. At the bottom of your screen, if you're not familiar with this platform, you'll see a variety of toolbars with engagement buttons or tools. They're resizable, movable, so move them around on your screen to get the best desktop use for you. If you do have questions during this webcast, there's the Q&A tab. You can submit those through the tool. We plan to address those at the end of the session. We'll leave some time for that, hopefully plenty of time. If not, we will follow up. We can follow up via email or otherwise afterwards if you have questions that remain unanswered. Under the Resources tab, you'll find a copy of today's slides and some relevant links. Live attendees will receive a follow-up email with the relevant certifications, continuing education information. If you're interested in the certificate of attendance, you can actually download one of those from the continuing education tool. We are recording today's program, so you will receive a notification when the on-demand version becomes available. If you do run into technical difficulties, try to refresh your screen. You can hit F5. You could also click the Help tool for some common questions or answers. My name is Bridget Penick. I am an employment law attorney here in the Des Moines office. And joining me today will be Ingrid Culp from our Minneapolis office. We have found through those last several months that our employment law group actually has become a lot closer and more team focus, being able to work together across the internet and phone platforms. So a silver lining of pandemic has shown through for us. We have on the there we go. The four topics that we're generally going to cover today: current trends. Then we'll talk about the various legal considerations that go along with remote working, then turn to practical considerations. And again, like I said, we'll leave some time for questions. So I'm going to cover the current trends, and we're kind of going to talk about where we've been and where we might be going with remote workforce. This is not a COVID-19 centered topic, but obviously the issues have become amplified as more people are working remotely during the pandemic. Before the pandemic, however, work from home was actually on the rise. There are various statistics out there. According to Global Workplace Analytics, in 2016, 43% of the workforce worked at home at least some of the time. And pre-pandemic, 80% of workers expressed that they wanted to work from home at least part-time. In fact, a third of those were willing to take a pay cut to do so. In 2018, 3.6% of the U.S. workforce worked at home at least half-time or more. The statistics show that about 56% of employees across the country have a job where at least some of what they do could be done at home or could be done remotely. And that was confirmed by a poll of workers themselves, who 62% of them identified as having tasks that could be done at least partly remotely. The statistics also about use of office have been informative in preparing for today. Studies show that desks tend to be vacant 50 to 60% of the time. So what do you do? What do we do with those? And are there some cost savings we can talk about later? So this shows that there's been some precedent and some momentum for remote workers in the years preceding the pandemic, and desire and willingness. So, you know, we think about what was the obstacle. One of the biggest roadblocks, frankly, is we all probably have experienced, is trust. If you can't see, you don't know what employees are doing, right? Managers simply often don't trust people to work. Out of sight, out of mind. You hear all these phrases. They're more used to managing by counting bodies and seats rather than by results. So it's been a leap of faith for many to transition to remote workforce. And how do you continue that productive, positive work environment? many employers and employees have just been thrust into this sort of unwillingly in the last several months. And some are finding out it's working rather well and some are not. So we can go on to currently, the Gallup organization did a poll recently. The most recent one I found was October 13th, that shows, compared to a high in April of 51%, currently about 33% of U.S. workers now work exclusively remotely. Those who work sometimes remotely is about 25%, a quarter of the workforce. That's actually up from the April number. So you show that shift of those from always to those who are sometimes working at home. And 41% of workers right now are never working remotely. They're back in the workspace entirely. And again, that has increased about by 10% since April. So we see that about 6 months, into the pandemic measures, trends have leveled out a little bit. The best estimate from this study, Global Workplace Analytics, is that 25 to 30% of the workforce will be working from home multiple days a week through the end of 2021. So that's another year out. We're looking at least a partial adjustment of various workplaces. So if you think you're behind the 8 ball or it's too late, this is still a relevant, timely discussion to how do you plan for this next year. So, addressing our title, it does seem remote work is here to stay, at least in some form, for the immediate future. We'll look at some trends of who's working on site. That same Gallup poll showed 46% of U.S. workers reported that all or nearly all of their coworkers are working on site. Again, that's up significantly from those numbers in April, where there were many orders across the country to work from home. 20% report that some employees are working on site, again, up just a little bit from April. 23% that very few are working on site, and we have 9% who say nobody's working on site, everyone remains remote. So where will these trends go? Will it ebb and flow with the rise in coronavirus cases? It's hard to know. On one hand, people are anxious to get out of home. On the other hand, it's getting colder. Equipment has been purchased. Families have scheduled, their routines, and some are comfortable here. So the impact on work, however, is really going to drive that, I think, for the decision makers here on this. We've seen employers who have set return to work dates and then extend them. And other businesses I know have just said, you just plan to work from home indefinitely if your job is one that is amenable to that, instead of setting these deadlines that they really can't predict for certain. One consideration that is significant, obviously, is employees' feelings and perspectives. The polling on employees' desire or concerns about returning to work is, I thought, significant to share. The same Gallup poll from October 13th showed that 29% of U.S. workers were not at all concerned about being exposed to coronavirus at work, and 26% were not too concerned about it. You have the categories of 34% who are moderately concerned and 11% who are very concerned. So we feel your pain dealing with a workforce that has such varied opinions and views, and none is obviously the right answer. So one question that we've seen in the news recently is the thought of a coronavirus vaccine being imminent, and it will be curious to see how that, if and how that changes the perspective and the desires of our workforce. Worker preferences, as of October 13th, nearly 2/3 of the remote workers want to continue working remotely. 35% said it was just because they prefer to do so. Convenience, productivity, other reasons. 30% say that desire is because of COVID-19 concerns. And then 35% are itching to get back to their normal pre-pandemic routine. Compared to this number to the slide earlier, that 80% of workers wanted to work from home, that total number is not quite so high. So I think we're finding that some people are either missing the social interaction, feeling the lack of productivity, and that's a good tip for you. I know we have HR folks, we have lawyers online, we have owners and managers. Are you taking the pulse of your workforce? How are they feeling? What are they wanting? That's not, unfortunately, going to be able to drive the decision, but it's obviously something you want to keep in mind and consider. What are we looking at? And you know, do you as an organization want to continue remote workforce, or implement it if you haven't, going forward? The trends or the rationale for remote workforce taking a pandemic out of the equation, I think, are important to review. I mean, for several years, the primary driver of working at home programs were to attract and retain talent. Those who didn't wish to relocate, those who, you know, it was really not employer-driven, but employee-driven. Now employers are seeing maybe some of the cost-saving opportunities. I think I mentioned before, 50 to 60% of the time employees are not at their desks. Well, what are we doing with the space and the furniture and the facilities? It could be a cost-saving opportunity. One study showed about $11,000 a year for every person who works remotely, even half of the time. I know when we were looking at building new office space here in Des Moines and in our Minneapolis office, the designers have been working with businesses who are looking at more of a hoteling. For those of you who have offices rather than manufacturing or other more fixed structures, can you share? You know, can Bridget say, I'm going to be in the work office 2 days a week and Ingrid 3 days a week, and we literally share an office. And I think that had been a trend that offices were going to pre-pandemic. So it can really reduce your real estate footprint. Reduced travel obviously means cost savings as well. Do we need to attend all of these CLEs in person? We like to do it. We like to interact in person. Maybe the need isn't quite as great as it has been. And then, you know, the environmental impact is really being noticed. You've seen some of those the global visuals of reduced smog and air pollution, and sustainability is something that is front of mind for many businesses and individuals right now. The annual environmental impact of half-time remote work would be, a study has shown, the greenhouse gas equivalent of taking the entire New York State workforce off the road. That would be significant if it's doable and possible. So we're seeing more and more environmental and sustainability issues brought into the dialogue. And we, you know, some of these initiatives that the government and candidates have been proponents of, might there be some credits or incentives for employers to reduce that physical footprint? We will see. We're going to turn now to Ingrid to start the legal consideration discussions.
Great. Thank you so much, Bridget, and good afternoon to everybody. It's wonderful to be with you all. Thank you for attending today. We're going to spend the next several minutes here going through various legal considerations. There are a lot of legal considerations to take into account when we are talking about a remote workforce, both in COVID-19 times and in non-pandemic times, whenever you have remote workers. So the first thing to keep in mind is federal, state, and local employment laws apply to employees working remotely. Just because an employee has decided to or been allowed to work from home or from their vacation in Hawaii or wherever they may be, the laws still apply. There's no forgiveness or non-application of the laws purely based on the location of where the work is being performed from. You might ask yourself then, well, which laws apply, particularly when we're talking about state and local laws? Typically, the primary work location of the employee will control which laws apply. So if you are a Minnesota-based company and you have an employee who is home officing in North Dakota or Wisconsin, the laws of the state where the employee is living and working will typically apply to that employee. And same goes for city-based laws. If you happen to have an employee who lives or works in a city that has some employment laws, oftentimes cities will enact anti-discrimination employment laws, or what we're seeing more and more frequently are paid sick leave laws that layer on top of all the other types of paid leave laws that are available to employees. This, of course, keeping track of state and local laws that apply to a workforce that is scattered throughout the United States or throughout various states or cities can be a real challenge and, frankly, headache for employers and for HR professionals. But it is really important to keep on top of, because if you don't keep on top of it, you're very likely to either see an employee raise the issue for you, that you have not been complying with the laws that apply to them, or it's possible, of course, to have a government entity reach out to you and either audit or tell you that you are not complying. Okay, so let's step back a minute and talk about who can work remotely. Are there any laws that dictate this or say an employee can't work remotely? There really, we'll talk about COVID-19 in a minute here, but there really aren't. It's really up to each company and each employer to decide which positions are able to work in a remote environment and which aren't. And practically speaking, the employee's position and job duties is largely going to dictate the outcome of that analysis. There are, of course, some jobs, I'm thinking of a manufacturing floor where an employee is on a manufacturing line and producing widgets that simply cannot be performed anywhere other than on that manufacturing line. Or I'm thinking of a nurse who treats his or her patients in person in a clinic or hospital setting. That job simply cannot be done from a remote setting. And then, of course, there are many, many jobs that can be performed from a remote setting. I think, of course, the vast majority of them are jobs that are largely performed using computer, telephone, internet, and those jobs are the ones that we are commonly seeing going to remote work. Who gets to decide? Let's say that an employee wants to work from home and the employer is thinking through that. Who gets to decide? Is an employer legally required to allow it? We'll come to that in a minute. Does the employer get to decide? Does the employee get to decide? Absent a law requiring work from home, and of course we have a couple of those right now in the COVID-19 environment, the employer typically gets to decide. So let's speak to COVID-19 just for a minute. There are various states, including in Minnesota, we're still under Governor Walz's order saying that if an employee's job can be performed from home, the employee should continue to work from home. Now, that leaves a lot of employers wondering, what do you do when the employer and the employee have a difference of an opinion on that? And that has happened. That is happening. I'm talking with my clients about that, where the company says, no, it's really not working for you working from home. And the employee says, well, I think it is, and I want to comply with Governor Walz's order. Employers and companies have a lot of discretion to make that decision, so long as it's, of course, made in a reasonable manner and based on the facts and circumstances available to the employer. Now, the employee can always choose to challenge that, and if so, make a complaint to the state, and there might be a state review or some sort of audit of the employer's decision. But if the employer's decision saying, nope, under Governor Walz's order, we really don't think your job can be performed remotely, is made, again, in good faith and is a reasonable decision based on sound facts and circumstances, my hope is that that will pass muster. We don't have a lot of precedent here because we don't know how those challenges are being handled, nor do we know the outcome of the challenges, but that's how most employers are approaching that. So again, setting aside orders saying that employees should work from home if their job allows them to work from home, the employer almost always typically gets to decide if an employee is allowed to work remotely. When making those decisions, though, of course, it's really important to make the decisions in a non-discriminatory manner. So you would never want any suggestion or appearance that you were making decisions about who gets to work remotely and who doesn't get to work remotely on a protected class basis or a discriminatory basis. So, for example, gender, age, race. I'm sure this would never happen, but just some kind of ridiculous examples. Let's say you decided at your company that women can work remotely, but men can't, because women are typically the primary caretaker of children. Or let's say at your company you decided that younger workers can work remotely, but older workers can't, because younger workers are more adept at the technology that allows for remote work. Those would be kind of blatant violations of our non-discrimination rules. If an employer is going to deny an employee's request to work from home, the denial really needs to be based on legitimate non-discriminatory business reasons that the employer is able to articulate. And again, the key here is really going to be the crux of the position. What are the employee's job duties? And what is the employer's position about why those job duties cannot be performed effectively in a remote environment? In certain cases, so again, the backdrop is that the employer almost always gets to decide, except under the duty of reasonable accommodation. In certain cases, the duty of reasonable accommodation of a disabled employee may require an employer to approve remote work if requested by the employee. As is always the case under the ADA and our disability accommodation scenarios, these decisions and inquiries are undertaken on a case-by-case basis. Really, again, the crux of this decision are what are the employee's essential job duties, and can the essential job duties be performed from home? Remember, the ADA does not require an employer to forgive an employee's performance of their essential job duties. So if the essential job duties can be performed remotely, then the request for accommodation should probably be granted. If the essential job duties simply cannot be performed remotely, then the ADA analysis would suggest that that request need not be granted. When having these conversations with an employee making a disability-related request to work remotely, you really follow your typical process. So you have an interactive process, a dialogue with the employee, ongoing communication with the employee that should be documented. So if the employee ever claims that their request fell on deaf ears, or that the employer didn't take it seriously or engage in a dialogue about it, you've got documentation to prove to the contrary. If you decide to grant, let's say that you as the employer are really quite concerned about the employee's ability to perform their job in a remote setting, but you're willing to give it a try. If you decide to grant it, I really like granting work from home accommodations when there are concerns about its effectiveness on a trial or temporary basis. This gives the employer a chance to show the outside world, if they're ever challenged, that they gave it a try. They were willing to be flexible and generous and give it a try. And it also gives the employer a chance to collect data about how it went. Was it effective or was it ineffective? And if it was ineffective, you will have had a chance again to show you gave it a try and collect data about why it was ineffective. If you are going to grant remote work as a form of reasonable accommodation on a temporary basis, it's really important to communicate that to the employee so that they know that this is not guaranteed forever and that it is subject to review and reconsideration by the employer, really at any time. I also recommend, and this is an important one, and I see this crop up in various settings, I don't recommend that you grant a trial or temporary trial run for a set period of time. So a lot of times I'll see an employer say, we're going to give this 60 days, or we're going to give this 90 days, or we're going to give this 6 months. And then the employer will come to me and say, well, we promised him we were going to give him 90 days, but we're 30 days in and we can tell right now this is not going to work. The fact that you promised the 90 days really can put the employer in a predicament. And so when granting something on a trial basis or a temporary basis, just use those words: trial basis, temporary basis, subject to review and reconsideration at any time by the employer. No set time period for when that might happen or how long this might be in effect. One question you're seeing a lot about reasonable accommodation, and one concern employers are having about the number of employees who have been working from home in our COVID-19 environment is, oh my gosh, now that we have had so many employees working from home on account of COVID-19, does this mean that we have totally opened Pandora's box for all requests for reasonable accommodation and will never be able to deny a request for reasonable accommodation to work from home? The EEOC addressed this in a Q&A that it published just in September. And the good news for employers is the EEOC said, no, that won't be the case. Just because the employer had to, either legally speaking or practically speaking on account of COVID-19, allow remote work, doesn't mean that they are now always going to have to allow remote work as an accommodation for a disability. I will caution employers, though, that the EEOC's full response goes on to say it can't be an automatic no. Whenever you have a request for accommodation to work remotely, you have to have a thoughtful process and a thoughtful response and go through the analysis. What are the essential functions? Can the employee effectively perform them from home, undue hardship, and all of the rest? The same kind of analysis arises under another EEOC question that was in the same guidance from September of this year. This question was a little bit different. Let's say you had an employee who requested work from home as a form of reasonable accommodation for a disability prior to COVID-19. The employer said no, that it wouldn't work because of the employee's job, really required in-person work. But then the employee was in fact sent home on account of COVID-19. Does that mean the employer now has to change course and allow work from home as an accommodation for that employee kind of forever? And here the EEOC said it depends. Basically the same concept, which is, okay, on account of COVID-19, everybody was forced into essentially a trial period for how work from home worked for this particular employee and position. And how did it go? Was the employee able to perform the essential functions from home? And if so, the ADA would suggest the employer needs to continue to allow that. If the employee wasn't able to perform their essential functions from home, then the EEOC is saying that the employer can pull back and say, okay, COVID-19 is over now. We did that because we had to do that then. It didn't work well. Here's why it didn't work well. And now you do need to come back to on-site work. Okay, next legal consideration for our remote workers, and this is nothing new. This is not unique to COVID-19. This has always been the case. But one challenge with remote workers, as Bridget alluded to earlier, is they are out of sight. We don't exactly know how they're spending their time or when they're working. And wage and hour laws, of course, for our non-exempt employees, our hourly non-exempt employees, requires that we keep really close tabs on our remote workers from a wage and hour standpoint. So all time work, of course, must be recorded. Employees must be paid for all of their working time, and they must be paid overtime pay if they happen to work more than 40 hours in a work week or be in a state that has a different overtime law. This makes correct classification of your exempt and non-exempt employees really critical, particularly if you have a large number of your workforce working from home. Let's say you have an entire position classification that is allowed to or required to work from home. And let's say that you have classified them as exempt, such that there is no record keeping, no overtime payment of hours worked. And then let's say that somebody in that class of employees or the government comes in and challenges your classification and says, no, employer, you got it wrong. These are non-exempt employees. You mistreated them as exempt. Well, you're going to have an entire class of employees who's been working from home, and you're going to have no record of their hours worked. And the government and the law is going to say to you, employer, that's on you. You got this wrong. We are going to look at the employee's recollection of their hours worked. And if it is in good faith and appears to be reasonable, and if you don't have evidence to prove it to the contrary, we're most likely going to take them at their word, and you're going to owe them a lot of back overtime. So with your non-exempt employees, again, complete and accurate time reporting. That includes no underreporting. So your remote workers should be told, and preferably in writing, that if they are working, that must be recorded as working time. They cannot work off the clock. Likewise, there should be no over-reporting. They should not record hours worked when they're not actually working. That would be fraud and essentially stealing from the company. So what, if you do have remote workers, non-exempt remote workers, what time recording system are you going to use? And is it working well for you? Is it effective? And is it easy to use and capturing that time worked? One thing we recommend for your non-exempt remote workers is set hours of work and prohibiting work outside of those set hours unless pre-approved. Now, remember, if an employee goes rogue, and you have a non-exempt employee who works more hours than they were told to work, you still have to pay them for it, even if it happens to be overtime hours. But if you've told them they can't do that without pre-approval and they're doing that anyway, that would be a policy violation. And the employee could be held accountable for that, including discipline up to and including termination. Really key for your supervisors and managers is enforcement of the wage and hour reporting requirements for your remote non-exempt employees. So if you have a supervisor or a manager who knows that you have a non-exempt employee working remotely, who's working way more hours than they're reporting, maybe they know that they worked on a Thursday night, but they look at the time record and it's not reflected in their time worked, or maybe they know that they're doing a lot of extra work and not recording it. The supervisor needs to talk to that employee. Again, enforcement of these rules and making sure that the supervisors know that your non-exempt hourly employees should be reporting all time worked, including Zoom calls and the like, is really important. Okay, Bridget, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions that have popped up, and I will hopefully address it with the next few slides about what do you do when you have these temporary work situations. And I fortunately do not have a black and white answer for everybody here, because the answer is it depends. So we'll talk about tax first. Generally, employees pay taxes to the state in which the work is performed. This is the physical presence rule. For example, if you are in Minnesota and your remote employee works in Iowa, under the physical presence rule, you would withhold unemployment taxes here in Iowa, even if you don't have an office here. But there are some exceptions. And we ran into this in my own household. My husband has always been a remote worker for his job. And it took almost a year to get his pay stubs, and there was no tax withheld. And it seemed the employer had, its default was to treat employees as if they were in Florida, where apparently there is no income tax. And by about October, I pushed him to nudge, we're going to get hit with a big tax bill here because they've not been withholding income tax. So it took some effort from his part to nudge the employer to actually start withholding for Iowa taxes. So, I mean, employees will be looking at this too, as the lesson of that little story there. There are some reciprocity agreements. States that border each other, like Minnesota and Iowa, may have agreements. I will give this big disclaimer now that Ingrid and I are not our tax lawyers. We are providing this tip to say consult with your tax preparers, your payroll folks, if you're lucky enough to have in-house folks to do that, or we can obviously connect you with our tax lawyers who do advise on these specific situations. But we're here to raise the issue that it's something that you need to consider, and it's not too late to fix for this year already. If you're having a bit of a panic moment, saying, "Oh no," payroll can get tricky. And these questions are showing that if you're near borders, employees travel to different sites. If the employee is working exclusively remotely, or, if you expand into new states and you have to figure out, like the Florida, Iowa issue with my husband's job. So, you'll have to, again, consider, what if they're only working for a few days? What if they're only temporarily? I mean, the problem, I think, with where we currently are is no one anticipated maybe that this remote emergency situation would last this long. States are trying, some are better than others at issuing guidance. So I think the first thing I would look for is your state Department of Finance taxing authority to say, do you have interim guidance? Many states do and many states don't. And you'll have to look at both your home state where you are and the state where the employee is working to determine which laws apply. There actually is, this question has come up, so I'll introduce it now before I get to the litigation piece. Now that we've got a home office set up as an employee, can we use that? Can we get a tax deduction for everything we bought? We know some employers are actually giving credits or allowances to employees to purchase equipment or providing equipment at home, and others aren't. And there's no requirement that you do so. But the tax changes as of 2018 completely say no to the answer of, can an employee get a deduction for the home office expenses? Previously, there was the 2% of your adjusted gross income rule. I remember looking at that, doing our own taxes with my husband's job, and that, at least between 2018 and 2025, is not a possibility. So under current federal income tax law, I'm not talking about state taxes here, but an employee home office is not deductible, just period. Independent contractors, self-employed workers, though, I mean, that's a different story, but we're talking about your businesses and your employees. So if you get asked that question, obviously recommend that your employees talk to their tax preparers, but the likely answer is no. That could change perhaps if there's another COVID relief package that does get passed, but we haven't seen any. That really hasn't been a driving issue in anything that we've seen so far. I did mention that, there are lawsuits over this already. And this lawsuit comes out of New Hampshire and Massachusetts, where New Hampshire has filed a lawsuit challenging Massachusetts' taxation of remote workers from New Hampshire. So they're close, and New Hampshire workers usually would drive to Massachusetts to work. There's about 80,000 employees at issue here. And they've been working at home in New Hampshire, but Massachusetts has continued to withhold the income tax. And it adopted one of these administrative rules saying that income tax earned by New Hampshire residents while working remotely are still going to be taxed in Massachusetts because it's for the business that resides in Massachusetts. So New Hampshire is filing this suit on behalf of its residents, trying to, I suppose, keep those taxes within New Hampshire as opposed to in Massachusetts. So Massachusetts claims that its rules consistent with other New England states. This is a very up in the air to be determined issue. And so, just be aware of that. Stay tuned to the news and the guidance in your state, and, do the best that you can to keep up and be aware and be flexible for changes. Zoning is another thing that is, I certainly didn't think of necessarily before preparing for this. Many municipalities actually require that you obtain a permit to have a home occupation permit, and it's really more on the local level than on the state level. So this, again, you're going to have to drill down to where these employees are working, and it might be, I know that my neighbor, for example, has decided they're going to go to spend a few weeks in Wisconsin, and they're going to work remotely in Wisconsin at the in-laws cabin. Then they'll be in Iowa. Then they went out to Montana. And so, I mean, that does get to be a bit of a head scratcher, and might be one of the reasons the employer says, no, we need you to choose a place, and that's where the work's going to be acceptable. Or back to the home office if it becomes an unmanageable issue. I suggest when you are not in the midst of an emergency pandemic, outline these things, and I will hit it again, in an actual policy or agreement, a work from home or remote worker agreement, and set forth who will obtain permits if they're necessary, who will pay for those, and have that ideally arranged upfront. But there's never too late to put things in writing now. And again, because many, but not all, of current remote workers are under these sort of emergency orders, like the one in Minnesota, There are some exceptions. I mean, the government does understand at this point that everyone's sort of caught off guard. And I think as long as you are attempting in good faith to comply, things will sort out themselves. Another consideration here is insurance, liability coverage. You want to ensure on your end that your policy will extend to cover workers working from home. And if you need a special rider or something like that, again, talk to your insurance carrier, your agent. And similarly, you may want to require to allow someone to work from home proof of homeowners or renters insurance, the ability to cover damage to, say, company equipment that they may be using at home. So again, ideally, this would be part of that written policy or agreement that you enter into with your employees as they begin working remotely. I-9s. I do a bit of immigration law in my practice, and this has been lots of immigration changes this year. I-9s are one that, again, hadn't come to mind until I saw the guidance. And I just checked this morning. The rule is, as you know, you must physically look at the work authorization and identification documents for I-9. The rule has been for remote workers. No, HR person in Iowa doesn't have to go to Florida to inspect that, but you have to engage someone to do an in-person inspection there, whether it's a notary public or often it's a staffing agency or something like that. You have to have an authorized representative. That rule has not changed. There is an exception, and so that is the case. You have to think about when you have remote workers, some remote workers, not all remote workers, you still have to comply with the I-9 physical inspection requirements. And I have had an HR person from Iowa fly to Florida to do that because it was a one-off employee, or he came up for training, actually, I think is how they ultimately ensured that compliance was sufficient. There is a temporary relaxation that allows for virtual inspection, but this is something that is confusing to many employers. The Immigration Department of Homeland Security only allows us if all of your workforce is remote. So if you have anybody in the office and you're going to hire new people to work who are going to work remotely, they still have to come in and do that in person. But if everyone's remote, you can do a virtual I-9 initially, and you would have to do the actual physical inspection whenever you get back to work. And this was implemented, I think, in April, and it's been extended for 60 days, 3 or 4 times now. The current extension is set to expire next week, November 19th, unless it's extended again. And so you just keep in mind, so much has happened. So if you had someone, you were all remote in March and April, and you onboarded anyone, eventually you're going to have to reconfirm those I-9s. Notice and postings also are things to think about when you have remote workers. We're talking, everyone knows the big government posters that are out. We know that the FFCRA notice poster has come out. And that one actually was implemented during a pandemic. And the DOL rule was you still have to slap it on the wall at your workplace, even if your employees are remote. Our best practice guidance, for full-time telecommuters or remote workers, you don't have to post these things in their home. They're not required to have them posted on the wall. If someone is what I consider a telecommuter, and these are terms of art, someone who literally goes back and forth, you have to ensure that they are aware in the workplace, in the office, where those posters are, where they are located. But your remote workers should have access to them as well. Hopefully they are duplicated in your policies. Hopefully you have access to your handbook or employment policies virtually for those workers. So you let them know where they're stored in the system, or distribute them by email, perhaps when someone begins working remotely, saying, here's a reminder of our policies. As a lawyer, we'll always tell you it's important to get acknowledgement of receipt and acknowledgement and understanding that they've received and are aware of and these policies. And if you push out any changes or new posters are required, I would do both, physically post them in your work site and send a virtual or hard copy if you want to mail one to your remote workers. Workers' comp, we've already touched on this a little bit. I mean, most states obviously do require that you provide workers' compensation coverage for employees. Remote workers being injured on the job is a little, did they stub their toe because their kid's toy was in the way? It's their work site. So the work comp carriers are getting accustomed to dealing with these types of claims. I say as the employer, as I always do, if there's a question of a workplace injury, let them submit the claim. You don't get to make that decision. You leave it to your work comp carrier. It's important, though, for the sake of defining the workplace, if the work area is the dining room table, if the work area is a home office, okay. So if someone, goes outside and breaks an arm on a trampoline during a break, that's not going to be a work comp injury, right? So make sure you have an understanding of what the work area is. Ergonomics reviews, those are like pie in the skies, honestly, to some of us, right? But I've learned, I've got the shoulder ache because my desk height isn't quite right when I work at home either, or doing a lot more on my phone than on my screen. My eyes, I feel like I have to get those special blue. My daughters all want those blue, I don't know what the lenses are, but the UV blockers or something. Just be aware that the work setting is a little bit different. Ingrid already mentioned setting set work hours. So again, if there's some injury at home, even in the home office that's outside of the work hours, it's a little more defensible from a work comp perspective. And so, we have on here reserve the right to inspect. I don't think in the current environment anyone is physically wanting to go into employees' homes to do that. Mm-hmm. But in a more safe environment, again, that is something that you might want to have in your telework arrangement or agreement with your employees. There's just a couple more considerations that are similar here. Again, under OSHA, there is no duty to inspect a home office, but you should reserve that right. And there is a duty to record those work-related injuries. And then the I think I spelled that wrong. It's FFCRA. That's a typo in your slide. Hopefully you know the Families First Coronavirus is the correct acronym. My bad. The question has come up when employees are working at home, and they have an exposure to COVID, for example, do they need to quarantine and do things change? And the rule really is the same. So if you're still able to telework, then you still telework, right? If you physically, if you're ill, you need leave and you need to be off work, then they really should not be working and can maybe be eligible for the FFCRA paid leave. The thing that has come up most recently is the school issue. Back in August, September, we advised you that if families elected for their children to work virtually, which many school districts allowed, then the employee wasn't really entitled to that leave because school was open. But now my own kids' district just announced a shutdown as of a move to online, I should say. And so you may find yourself with a remote worker who now is in a place where the children are home and they do have a child care obligation. And so you may need to reconsider or look at the 2/3 pay, the emergency family leave under the family FFCRA. And again, that is set to end on December 31st. And that has not yet been extended. So one way that I know employers have worked around that is to maybe adjust work schedules. If you have to supervise a child at home online between 10 and 2, then maybe the work day starts at 2. I know some have split their schedules, and one spouse is able to work from 6 a.m. to noon, and the other 12 to 6 or whatever the rules are. So, some flexibility may even have to come into play now as circumstances changes. We've already talked about, unemployment. You also want to make sure, like the other tax and payroll issues, that you are complying with the rules and affect where the employee works. Ingrid covered some the general wage and hour issues, but again, break and rest period laws may vary based on location. paid and unpaid leave. We don't have a paid sick leave rule in Iowa. I understand there's at least one in Minneapolis. So depending on where those employees are working, it may vary. So we feel your pain and the headache that may come along with this. And even final pay and vacation payout. Iowa doesn't require payout of vacation unless you have a policy to do so. And other states, Illinois, I know does. And so we've had that situation come up when your workers are not working in the same state where your business is. The last slide that I'll cover here is another kind of set of considerations for you. Non-competes and non-solicitation agreements. I have had this come up quite a bit pre-COVID. The law of the state where the employee lives or works is what generally controls. Now, I have employers who will write agreements and they understand risks and they say, we want to just say Iowa law will apply. We understand that the employee is in Nebraska even, who has stricter non-compete rules. And that's enough. We understand that may not be enforceable. I don't advise that approach because why draft an agreement that's not going to be enforceable, but that employer has chosen just for consistency to do that. So I always encourage, if you hire someone in a state where you haven't had an employee before, have your in-house or outside counsel review all of the laws that are applicable in that state. Similarly, independent contractor classifications, if you attended our big seminar, you heard that those rules may be changing on a federal level. The state revenue departments may have different interpretations of that. And then with my immigration practice, we've just run into this H-1B dilemma. So if any of you have H-1B temporary workers, I had an employer, who's in North Carolina, where the employee had worked in one metro area in the office and was working remotely at home, and that was far enough away to be a different metropolitan statistical area. That's what MSA is. So the wage that was required to be paid was higher. So I just did a quick check before I got on today. And for example, if one of my employers has a software developer who's an H-1B who normally works in Ames, Iowa, which is 30 miles up the road, and has been working from home here in Des Moines, it's a $20,000 prevailing wage difference. So those are considerations that may not be top of mind, but that's why you're here today, to dig a little bit deeper and see what issues you should look at. All right, Ingrid.
Okay, great. Thank you, Bridget. I'm going to go pretty quickly through the practical considerations in the hopes of leaving some time for Q&A. And then again, if we don't get to your question, we will reach out to you. So a whole host of practical considerations with your remote workers. One, of course, that's top of mind is protection of the company's confidential information and data security. And I am not an IT expert, nor pretend to be, so I don't know exactly how to do many of these things, but I think it's really important, particularly if confidential information and trade secrets are really sensitive within your company, to partner with your IT people so that you have a good system in place with your remote workers. A super easy thing, of course, to do, and you should do with all your employees, including your remote employees, is have a confidentiality agreement with your employees. Only provide your remote workers confidential information on a need-to-know basis. To try to limit what's out there and to who has access to it. It's really important that your remote workers know that your IT and confidentiality policies and practices apply to them working remotely. That just because they're offsite doesn't mean that they're somehow forgiven from those obligations and expectations. And then again, work really closely with your IT staff to make sure that you have the right systems in place on whatever home computer or company computer is being used remotely, so that you have the best protection possible for your data. Company property, if you are going to provide company property to a remote worker to allow them to do their work remotely, it's really important to have a detailed accounting of what you've provided. So you've got a good record of that for when it comes time to go retrieve it or time to have it returned to you. We recommend an agreement with the employee regarding good care, reporting damage, loss, or destruction. Do remember, just a little reminder, if company property is damaged, destroyed, lost, etc., and you want to recoup that loss through wage deduction from the employee, there are many states that prohibit that absent the employee's written consent. So wage deduction will not be a good repayment system unless you've really reviewed state law and done that in accordance with state law. It's important to have a good agreement and process for prompt return of company equipment at end of employment, or really at any time the company may so request. I've seen more and more employers, it's of course an expense to the company, but more and more companies sending a prepaid FedEx box to their remote workers for return of company property. And that seems to be working really well, as opposed to just leaving it to the employee to pack it up, go find a shipment processor, and then deal with the expense of that. As Bridget mentioned, we really recommend with your remote workers having a remote working agreement. Of course, this can take a template form, and then you can tailor it as needed for the individual employees. But some really important things to address are: what's the location of work that's been agreed upon? What are the agreed upon work hours, work area? Again, protection and return of company data and property. What resources and equipment are going to be provided, what aren't? Who's going to pay for what? Who's going to pay for the internet connection and the printer ink and that type of thing? Do you have certain productivity or accessibility expectations, like you will respond promptly to emails within 30 minutes of receiving them, or you need to produce 50 accounting reports a day, or whatever it might be? Is it important for that job to address those specifically? And then, of course, a reminder that even though they've been approved to work from home, that there may be occasion where they need to report in person for meetings or other things, and that will be expected even though they are typically a remote worker. We also like to see in remote working agreements provision saying that the employee should not be caring for others during their working hours. So whether that is a child or an elderly parent or whatever it may be, no dependent care of others during their working hours, unless for some reason that's okay with the company. What's the system for reporting absences? Again, this is kind of, there's a lot of honor system and a lot of trust that goes on with your remote workers. And so how are you going to know if they're absent and taking a day off? What is the system for reporting that, and then making sure that they take a vacation day or PTO day? A reminder that all your company policies apply equally to your remote workers, your anti-harassment, your all the company policies apply with equal force. And then what's the duration of the agreement? Again, kind of similar to a comment I made earlier, I recommend no specific duration or promise of duration. Just, hey, this is our agreement. We're allowing you to work remotely. It'll be subject to review and reconsideration and revocation by the company at any time for any reason. Integrating and managing a remote workforce, and I think there's a lot being written about this right now and talked about in the COVID-19 environment. But what are some of the downfalls of working remotely, and how can employers combat that? So, we're hearing employees who don't like working remotely saying, I don't know my coworkers as well. I don't have social time with them. I feel isolated at home. I never feel like I'm off. My working hours bleed into my dinner time hours, which bleed into my evening hours. Distractions at home, poor communication between employees, coworkers, managers, supervisors. Again, difficult to supervise and manage. I fear some companies are probably skipping or missing or delaying their performance management or review system. So what are some recommendations? With regard to new hires, of course, go through the same formal orientation and onboarding process you would with an on-site employee. Really important not to skip that stuff so everybody's on the same page. Plan a formal introduction to their manager and to their team. Again, of course, it can be by Zoom or some other tool, but make those connections kind of formal and obvious right from the outset. Train managers how to best supervise remote workers. And, you know, again, there's a lot out there about what are some best practices. Having open and ongoing communication regarding job duties and expectations, I think is increasingly important so that those things don't fall through the cracks. Regular and ongoing performance feedback, of course, both positive and constructive. I know a lot of managers out there have started to have regular and scheduled check-ins with their team, whether it's in a team setting or whether it's in a one-on-one setting. You know, every Tuesday morning the team meets, or every Thursday afternoon the manager meets with Susie just to talk about how are things going, what do you need. All company meetings and updates, push those out in a Zoom or remote format so everybody can participate. And then kind of the social isolation piece, consider virtual social opportunities. Could you do meet and greets via Zoom? Can you do, I know some companies are doing happy hours via Zoom where it's no work, grab something you want to drink and let's just all hang out, or coffee chats. I know our law firm has done some game nights and trivia nights via Zoom, just giving an opportunity for people to connect in kind of a non-working setting. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much for being with us today. If you have a few minutes to hang on with us, Bridget, are there some questions you want to tackle?
Thank you, Ingrid. I have sent off a couple of responses to the questions. Here is one, and maybe I won't identify the asker just in case we're bashful about that, but due to COVID, our office staff transitioned to work from home in March. This transition is now indefinite for those employees who wish to continue working from home. What can we do as an employer to help the employees establish a more permanent working space at home? What are you seeing companies do? In what dollar amount provide a stipend or one-time payment to support these employees from home? And you know, we both may have some answers there, and I think that's a good consideration. I know that some businesses have said here is you know, equipment that you can take. On the flip side, here is a stipend. $500 is one that I have seen an employer provide and say, here's this money, you know, you spend it as you see fit to equip your office, and, you know, suggestions. Others have partners with, whether it's your normal software provider or hardware provider, and, you know, allow employees to purchase through those systems. So those are some ideas. Ingrid, do you have any other?
No, nope. I think, no, I don't have anything to add to that. I'll take one because I think it has come up in a couple of the questions. Basically, the idea is we're a Minnesota company with a Minnesota employee, but we do allow one or more employees from time to time to work remotely on a really temporary basis. You know, I'm going to go to California to visit my parents, and I'm going to work out of my parents' home for 2 months, and then I'll be returning to Minnesota. And the question is, in that case, is the Minnesota employer required to comply with all the state laws and requirements of the state where the employee is working on a really temporary basis? There's probably a technical answer and a practical answer. The practical answer, if it's really temporary, it's not likely to recur with any frequency. I think most employers are not going to the trouble of trying to figure out what those state laws are and how to address them or how to apply them to that employee. And in my experience, I've never seen that come back to haunt an employer. I think the technical answer is probably more complicated than that, particularly in California, where there are just some states that are so protective of anybody working from their state that if we happen to actually pull the statute, there might be a technical argument that the employee was protected in some way. Bridget, I don't know if you have anything more to add to that.
No, I would say the same thing. I mean, I think, again, everyone in most states that have been issuing the guidance have said, we understand that currently temporary, and I'm going to say coronavirus, but the question may be broader than that. Let's just say you want to go, you know, spend spring break and work remotely or something like that. I totally agree with you that it's not really the temporary short very, very short-term scenarios that are a concern. We tried to make this program a little bit more broad. And if you hire someone intending that they remotely work permanently in another state, these considerations need to be vetted in those states.
Great. As I'm looking at the other ones here, I think we can reach out to these individuals separately, just given the time. I want to be respectful of people's time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think, there's one quick one. Are you required to provide any equipment, computer, phone, etc.? I think generally the answer would be, you can put that in your agreement. And I'm thinking more long-term, a permanent remote hire versus on these temporary state-mandated leaves. You've got to do the best that you can. If you want practically speaking, you want your employees to be productive while they are not able to come to the office, I would suggest that you provide the equipment that they need. I think that the safety and security issue, you can control more if it is a company product rather than having employees use their own resources. So I don't know that there's any specific requirement. There might be state, I'm thinking of California as well, might be a state that says you must equip a home office if you allow, but I haven't seen that. I'm just saying that you should check those or have us check those for you.
Great. Well, I think we will wrap up. Thank you again for everyone for attending today. And if you have follow-up questions or issues that come up related to remote workers or anything else, please feel free to reach out to Bridget or myself. Thank you very much.